In the autumn of 1853, the plantation records of Blackwood Manor in Talbot County, Georgia, ceased abruptly. The final entry, written in the careful script of overseer Samuel Hartwell, noted only that the evening meal had been served and that all hands were accounted for. What followed was a silence that would echo through the pine forests and cotton fields for generations to come. The Blackwood family had arrived in Georgia in 1828, purchasing nearly 2,000 acres of fertile bottomland along the Altamaha River. By 1850, the plantation housed 47 enslaved individuals, making it a modest but prosperous operation in the region. The main house, a two-story structure with wide verandas and tall windows, overlooked quarters that stretched in neat rows toward the river bend. Among the enslaved population was a man known only as Moses, though plantation records suggest this was not his birth name. Parish baptismal records from 1849 indicate he was approximately 30 years of age, tall in stature, and noted for his unusual relationship with the plantation's hunting dogs. Unlike other enslaved individuals who worked the fields or tended the house, Moses occupied a peculiar position in the plantation hierarchy. The Blackwood family patriarch, Colonel James Blackwood, had acquired Moses in 1847 from an estate sale in Savannah. The bill of sale, preserved in the Talbot County Courthouse until a fire in 1962 destroyed many such records, listed Moses as skilled in animal husbandry and tracking. What made this purchase remarkable was the price paid, nearly double the standard rate for a field hand of similar age and physical condition. According to testimony gathered by a circuit judge in 1854, Moses possessed an extraordinary ability to train hunting dogs for silent pursuit. This skill proved invaluable to Colonel Blackwood, who prized his weekend hunting expeditions through the vast pine forest that bordered his property. The dogs under Moses's care could track game for miles without making a sound, communicating through subtle movements and gestures that seemed almost supernatural to observers. The overseer's wife, Martha Hartwell, later described to church officials how Moses would disappear into the woods for hours with a pack of 6 or 7 dogs. They would return at dusk, moving like shadows across the plantation grounds. The dogs appeared different somehow, she claimed, their eyes reflecting an intelligence that unsettled her. She noted that after these training sessions, the animals would no longer bark or howl, even when approached by strangers. Life at Blackwood Manor followed the rigid patterns common to plantation society. The enslaved community rose before dawn, worked the fields until sunset, and gathered in their quarters for the evening meal. Moses, however, operated outside these routines. He slept in a small cabin near the kennels, separated from the other quarters by nearly a quarter-mile. This isolation was not punishment, but privilege, a recognition of his unique value to the Blackwood family. Colonel Blackwood's son, Thomas, who was 23 years old in 1853, frequently accompanied Moses on hunting expeditions. Thomas had developed a fascination with his father's methods of training both dogs and men. Letters discovered in the ruins of the main house in 1968 suggest that Thomas believed Moses possessed knowledge that could be applied beyond the realm of animal training. The autumn of 1853 brought an unusually early frost to Talbot County. Cotton harvest began in late September, earlier than anyone could remember. The enslaved community worked longer hours to gather the crop before weather could damage it. Moses, meanwhile, spent increasing amounts of time in the deep woods with his pack of silent dogs. Martha Hartwell's diary, donated to the Georgia Historical Society by her great-granddaughter in 1958, contains increasingly disturbed entries from this period. She wrote of hearing no sounds from the dog kennels at night, when previously the animals would bark at every disturbance. The silence, she noted, felt heavy and unnatural. On the evening of October 13th, 1853, the Blackwood family gathered for their customary Sunday dinner. Present were Colonel Blackwood, his wife Margaret, their son Thomas, and Thomas's new bride, Catherine, who had arrived from Charleston just 2 weeks prior for their honeymoon at the plantation. Also present was Overseer Samuel Hartwell and the house servants who attended the meal. According to later testimony from the cook, an enslaved woman named Sarah, the dinner proceeded normally until approximately 8 o'clock. At that time, Moses appeared at the rear entrance to the house, something that had never occurred in Sarah's memory. He spoke quietly with Colonel Blackwood, who then dismissed the house servants and called for his son and son-in-law to join him on the rear veranda. What transpired during this conversation was never recorded, but Sarah later told investigators that she observed the men follow Moses toward the kennels. The women remained in the house, where Catherine complained of feeling unwell and retired to her chambers. Margaret Blackwood and Martha Hartwell spent the evening in the parlor, expecting the men to return within the hour. They never did. Sarah's testimony, preserved in a handwritten account by the visiting circuit judge, describes the growing anxiety in the house as the hours passed. By midnight, Margaret Blackwood had sent Sarah to check the kennels. The young woman returned, claiming the structures were empty. No dogs, no men, no sign of disturbance. When dawn broke on October 14th, the absence of the Blackwood men created immediate chaos. The overseer's wife dispatched riders to neighboring plantations and to the county seat, but no trace of the missing men could be found. More disturbing was the complete disappearance of Moses and the entire pack of hunting dogs. In the days that followed, search parties combed the pine forests and river bottoms without success. The silence that had characterized Moses's trained dogs now seemed to envelope the entire plantation. Even the natural sounds of the Georgia wilderness, birdsong, insect noise, the rustle of small animals, appeared muted in the areas where the search concentrated. A week after the disappearance, Margaret Blackwood made the difficult decision to travel to Savannah to consult with her late husband's business associates and legal advisors. Catherine, still recovering from what she described as a persistent illness, remained at the plantation under Martha Hartwell's care. It was during Margaret's absence that Catherine made her first significant disclosure. Speaking to Martha in the privacy of her chambers, she revealed that her brief marriage to Thomas had exposed her to disturbing conversations about the methods employed at Blackwood Manor. Thomas, she claimed, had spoken of experiments in control and obedience that extended beyond animal training. Catherine's account, recorded in Martha's diary, suggested that Moses had developed techniques for inducing complete compliance in both animals and humans through methods that combined physical conditioning with psychological manipulation. The silence of the dogs, she indicated, was not merely a training achievement, but the result of a more profound alteration of their natural behaviors. These revelations took on new significance when Catherine began experiencing episodes of memory loss. She would find herself in locations on the plantation with no recollection of how she had arrived there. Sometimes she discovered herself standing at the edge of the pine forest, facing the darkness between the trees, with muddy feet and clothing that suggested she had been walking for hours. Martha's diary entries from this period reflect growing fear and isolation. With Margaret still in Savannah and the overseer missing, the two women found themselves responsible for maintaining order among the enslaved population, while confronting inexplicable events that challenged their understanding of the world. The enslaved community, meanwhile, had organized itself under the leadership of an older man named Job, who had served as a field foreman. According to later testimony, Job claimed that Moses had spoken to him on the night of the disappearance, warning him to keep the community together and to avoid the pine forest until the teaching was complete. Albeit, what Moses meant by the teaching became clearer when Catherine's condition worsened. She began speaking in her sleep, carrying on what sounded like conversations with invisible companions. Martha, sleeping in an adjacent room to monitor Catherine's welfare, transcribed these nocturnal monologues in her diary. The conversations followed consistent patterns. Catherine would respond to unheard questions with detailed descriptions of hunting techniques, methods of tracking prey through dense vegetation, and strategies for moving without detection. Most disturbing was her apparent knowledge of the plantation's layout, including areas she had never visited and architectural details of structures she had no reason to know. When Margaret Blackwood returned from Savannah in early November, she found her daughter-in-law in a state that defied medical explanation. Catherine responded to commands with an immediacy that seemed almost mechanical, but she showed no recognition of familiar faces or objects. She could perform complex tasks related to plantation management, but appeared unable to engage in normal conversation. Margaret immediately summoned Dr. Elias Pemberton from Savannah, who spent 3 days at the plantation examining Catherine and documenting her condition. His report, preserved in the records of the Medical College of Georgia until those files were transferred to microfilm in 1967 and subsequently lost, described symptoms that had no precedent in his experience. Dr. Pemberton noted that Catherine exhibited perfect physical coordination and enhanced sensory awareness, particularly acute hearing and night vision. She could navigate the plantation grounds in complete darkness and detect sounds imperceptible to others. However, she showed no emotional responses and seemed incapable of independent thought or action without explicit instruction. More troubling was Catherine's apparent communication with the missing hunting dogs. During his 3rd night at the plantation, Dr. Pemberton observed Catherine standing motionless on the rear veranda for several hours. At precisely midnight, he noted the sound of movement in the pine forest, a subtle rustling that seemed to approach the house before retreating back into the darkness. Catherine responded to these sounds with subtle gestures and movements that reminded Dr. Pemberton of the hand signals used by hunters to direct their dogs. When he attempted to interrupt her apparent communication, she turned toward him with an expression he described as utterly vacant yet somehow predatory. Atui. The following morning brought the discovery that would transform the investigation from a missing persons case into something far more disturbing. Job, while leading a group of field hands to clear drainage ditches near the river, uncovered what appeared to be a deliberately excavated chamber beneath the root system of a massive live oak tree. The chamber, approximately 8 feet square and 6 feet deep, contained evidence of recent occupation. Scattered throughout the space were items of clothing identified as belonging to the missing men, along with tools and implements whose purpose remained unclear. Most significant was a collection of notebooks filled with detailed observations written in multiple handwritings, including that of Moses, Colonel Blackwood, and Thomas. The notebooks documented a series of experiments conducted over several months prior to the October disappearance. The entries described techniques for breaking down what the writers termed natural resistance in both animals and humans through combinations of isolation, repetitive conditioning, and gradual elimination of individual will. According to these records, Moses had not been merely training hunting dogs, but developing methods for creating what the writers called perfect compliance. The goal was to produce beings, whether animal or human, capable of following complex instructions without question, while retaining their physical capabilities and specialized skills. The notebooks revealed that Thomas Blackwood had been an enthusiastic participant in these experiments, viewing them as a more efficient approach to plantation management. Colonel Blackwood's entries suggested initial skepticism that gradually gave way to fascination with the results Moses achieved. Most disturbing were the final entries, written in the days immediately preceding the disappearance. These described preparations for what Moses termed the final demonstration, a test of whether the techniques could be applied successfully to members of the plantation's ruling class. Catherine, the notebooks revealed, had been selected as the primary subject for this demonstration. Her recent arrival at the plantation and lack of familiarity with its routines made her an ideal candidate for the conditioning process. The honeymoon period provided cover for the extended isolation and controlled environment necessary for the transformation. The notebook entries ended abruptly on October 12th, the day before the disappearance. The final entry, written in Moses's hand, consisted of a single line, "Tomorrow we teach the teachers." Dr. Pemberton's investigation took on new urgency with these discoveries. He attempted to examine Catherine more thoroughly, but she had disappeared from her chambers sometime during the night. A search of the plantation grounds revealed no trace of her whereabouts. Margaret Blackwood, faced with the loss of her entire family and the collapse of everything she understood about plantation life, made the decision to abandon Blackwood Manor. She arranged for the sale of the enslaved population to neighboring plantations and departed for Charleston, where she lived with relatives until her death in 1861. The property remained empty for several years, during which time local residents reported unusual activity in the pine forests surrounding the former plantation. Hunters complained that game animals in the area behaved strangely, moving in organized patterns that suggested human direction. Dogs, brought into the forest by tracking parties, would refuse to proceed beyond certain points, exhibiting signs of extreme distress. In 1857, the property was purchased by a consortium of investors who planned to subdivide it for smaller farms. The surveying team sent to map the land reported discovering a series of excavated sites throughout the pine forest, each similar to the chamber found beneath the live oak tree. More significantly, the surveyors reported encountering a group of individuals living deep in the forest who appeared to be maintaining some form of organized community. Attempts to make contact with this group were unsuccessful, as the individuals would disappear at the first sign of approach. The surveyor's description of these forest dwellers matched the physical characteristics of the missing Blackwood men, though they were unable to confirm identification due to the distance and brief nature of the sightings. What struck them as most unusual was the presence of what appeared to be a pack of large dogs that moved with the group in perfect coordination. Local law enforcement made several attempts to locate and investigate this forest community, but the efforts proved futile. The group seemed capable of moving through the dense vegetation without leaving tracks and could disappear completely when pursued. The mystery deepened in 1859 when Catherine Blackwood emerged from the forest and appeared at a Methodist church in the neighboring county during Sunday services. She walked to the front of the congregation and stood silently until the minister approached her. According to witness testimony preserved in church records, Catherine appeared physically healthy, but showed no recognition of her own name or personal history. She responded to direct commands, but seemed incapable of independent communication. Most unsettling to the congregation was her apparent inability to participate in the service. She showed no response to hymns, prayers, or scripture readings. The minister, Reverend Joshua Atwood, took Catherine into his household and attempted to restore her memory through prayer and counseling. His journal, donated to the Methodist Historical Society in 1952, documents his growing realization that Catherine's condition was not a medical ailment, but the result of what he termed deliberate reduction of the human spirit. After several weeks of observation, Reverend Atwood noted that Catherine exhibited behaviors remarkably similar to those of a well-trained hunting dog. She would remain motionless for hours until given specific instructions, which she would then execute with perfect precision. She showed enhanced physical capabilities, including exceptional strength and endurance, but these improvements seemed to come at the cost of emotional capacity and independent thought. Most disturbing to the minister was Catherine's response to certain sounds and signals. Late at night, she would position herself at the windows facing the forest and remain there until dawn, as if awaiting instructions that never came. During these vigils, Reverend Atwood observed her making subtle gestures that reminded him of the hand signals used by hunters to communicate with their dogs. After 6 months of unsuccessful attempts to restore Catherine's condition, Reverend Atwood made the difficult decision to commit her to the Georgia State Sanitarium in Milledgeville. The institution's records, destroyed in a fire in 1923, reportedly documented her case as unprecedented in the medical literature of the period. Catherine remained at the sanitarium until her death in 1867. According to the brief mention in the local newspaper, she died peacefully in her sleep, but never regained her memory or capacity for independent thought. Her body was buried in the institution's cemetery under a marker that identified her only as unknown female, age approximately 30. The fate of the missing Blackwood men was never definitively established. The sightings of the forest community continued sporadically through the 1860s, but these reports became increasingly infrequent as the area was gradually cleared for farming and development. The last documented sighting occurred in 1868, when a team of Confederate veterans searching for a location to establish a sawmill reported encountering an elderly white man deep in the pine forest, who was accompanied by several large dogs. The man, they claimed, showed signs of advanced age and malnutrition, but moved through the vegetation with remarkable skill and silence. When the veterans attempted to approach, the man and dogs melted into the forest so quickly that the witnesses questioned whether they had seen anything at all. More disturbing was their observation that the dogs made no sound throughout the encounter, no barking, no panting, not even the rustle of paws on fallen leaves. By 1870, the original Blackwood Manor property had been completely transformed. The pine forest was cleared, the plantation house demolished, and the land converted to small family farms. The new residents reported no unusual activity, and the strange sightings ceased entirely. However, the story of Blackwood Manor continued to circulate through the oral tradition of the local community. Former enslaved individuals who had been sold to other plantations carried with them accounts of Moses's unusual abilities and the mysterious disappearance of the plantation's white family. These stories, passed down through generations, consistently emphasized the theme of reversal, the enslaved becoming the master, the hunter becoming the hunted. They spoke of justice delivered not through violence, but through the application of the same techniques used to break the spirits of others. Modern historians who have examined the surviving records of Blackwood Manor note several factors that lend credibility to the essential elements of the story. The abrupt cessation of plantation records in October 1853 is documented fact, as is the subsequent abandonment of the property by Margaret Blackwood. The bill of sale for Moses, though the original document was destroyed, was referenced in multiple legal proceedings related to the plantation's dissolution. The unusually high price paid for his acquisition, along with his specialized role in the plantation hierarchy, suggests that his abilities were indeed considered extraordinary by his contemporaries. Perhaps most significantly, the techniques described in the recovered notebooks align closely with methods documented in other historical instances of systematic behavioral conditioning. The combination of isolation, repetitive training, and gradual erosion of individual will represents a sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation that was remarkably advanced for the period. The medical documentation of Catherine's condition, though now lost, was referenced in several academic papers published in the early 1900s by researchers studying unusual psychiatric cases. These references consistently describe symptoms that had no recognized medical explanation, but showed patterns suggesting external causation rather than mental illness. The excavated chambers discovered throughout the former plantation grounds were eventually filled in by later property owners, but their existence was confirmed by multiple independent sources. The deliberate nature of their construction and their strategic placement throughout the forest area suggests a level of organization that supports the theory of systematic activity rather than random events. What remains most puzzling to contemporary researchers is the question of motivation. The notebook suggests that Moses viewed his actions not as revenge, but as education, an attempt to teach his oppressors the experience of complete powerlessness that defined enslaved existence. The silence that characterized his trained dogs may have served as a metaphor for the enforced silence of enslaved people, who were expected to endure suffering without complaint or resistance. By imposing that same silence on those who had held power over him, Moses may have been creating a form of understanding through shared experience. The disappearance of the Blackwood men into the forest, rather than their deaths, suggests a transformation rather than destruction. They became part of the very system they had once controlled, reduced to the same level of powerlessness they had imposed on others. This interpretation is supported by the sightings of the forest community, which consistently described individuals who appeared to be following rather than leading, moving in response to signals and commands rather than exercising independent will. The reversal of the traditional power structure was complete. The case of Blackwood Manor illustrates the complex dynamics of power and control that defined plantation society in the antebellum South. It suggests that the knowledge and skills possessed by enslaved individuals were far more sophisticated than their oppressors recognized or acknowledged. Moses's abilities in animal training represented just one example of the expertise that enslaved people developed while remaining invisible to those who claimed ownership over them. The techniques he employed to train dogs in complete silence required an understanding of animal psychology that would have been considered advanced even by contemporary standards. The application of these same techniques to human subjects represents a disturbing evolution of these skills, but one that can be understood within the context of systematic dehumanization that characterized slavery. Having been treated as property themselves, enslaved individuals like Moses may have developed insights into the mechanisms of control that their oppressors never fully grasped. The ultimate fate of the Blackwood men remains a matter of speculation, but the pattern of sightings suggests that they survived their transformation and adapted to their new circumstances. Living in the forest under Moses' direction, they experienced the reality of existence without autonomy or individual will. Whether this represented justice, revenge, or simply the natural consequence of the system they had participated in creating remains an open question. What is certain is that the power dynamics of Blackwood Manor were fundamentally altered in ways that challenged every assumption about race, control, and human nature that plantation society depended upon. The silence that descended over Blackwood Manor in October 1853 was not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of a different kind of communication, one that operated below the level of conscious awareness and relied on subtle signals invisible to casual observation. This silence continued to characterize the area long after the original participants had disappeared or died. Visitors to the region throughout the late 1800s reported an unusual quality to the quiet in the former plantation grounds, as if the very landscape retained memory of events that had transformed it. Local residents developed an informal tradition of avoiding the area after dark, not because of any specific threat, but because of a persistent feeling that they were being observed and evaluated. This sensation was particularly strong for white visitors, who reported feeling suddenly aware of their own vulnerability in ways they had never previously experienced. The story of Blackwood Manor was eventually recorded by a graduate student in folklore at the University of Georgia who conducted interviews with elderly residents in 1956. Her thesis, titled Oral Traditions of Reversal in Post-Antebellum Georgia, was completed in 1958, but never published due to what her advisor described as sensitivity regarding racial themes. The thesis manuscript, discovered in the university archives in 1966, provides the most comprehensive academic treatment of the Blackwood Manor case. It includes interviews with descendants of both enslaved and white residents of the area, along with analysis of the historical record and examination of similar cases from other regions. The researchers' conclusion was that the events at Blackwood Manor represented a unique instance of what she termed instructional reversal, a deliberate role exchange designed to provide education rather than punishment. She argued that Moses's actions demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of both individual psychology and social dynamics that enabled him to transform oppressors into their own victims. This interpretation suggests that the case of Blackwood Manor was not an isolated incident of revenge, but part of a broader pattern of resistance that operated through knowledge and skill rather than violence. The silence that characterized Moses's methods may have been replicated in other locations by other individuals who possessed similar insights into the mechanisms of control. The graduate student's research identified several other cases from the same period in Georgia and neighboring states where plantation families disappeared under mysterious circumstances, often preceded by reports of unusual animal behavior and strange sounds from surrounding forests. In each case, the plantation's enslaved population reported visits from traveling individuals who claimed special knowledge of animal training. These cases shared common elements: the sudden transformation of hunting dogs from vocal to silent behavior, the disappearance of white family members during nighttime hours, and subsequent sightings of these individuals living in forest communities under conditions that mirrored enslaved existence. The pattern suggests the existence of a network of individuals who possessed specialized knowledge and were willing to apply it in service of what they considered educational justice. The coordination required for such a network would have demanded communication methods that remained invisible to the dominant white society. The silence that characterized Moses's trained dogs may have served as both a practical tool and a symbolic statement about the enforced voicelessness of enslaved people. By teaching others to experience that same silence, Moses and his associates were creating a form of understanding that could not be achieved through conventional communication. The effectiveness of this approach is demonstrated by the lasting impact of these cases on local communities. Generations after the original events, residents continued to speak in whispers about the plantations where families had vanished, and former plantation grounds remained largely uninhabited despite their agricultural value. This collective memory suggests that the instructional reversal achieved its intended effect, creating an awareness of vulnerability and powerlessness that fundamentally altered the relationship between former oppressors and their victims. The silence that began with Moses's dogs had become a permanent feature of the social landscape. As the 20th century progressed and direct memories of slavery faded, the story of Blackwood Manor evolved into legend. However, the essential elements remained consistent across different tellings: the enslaved man who trained dogs to hunt in silence, the disappearance of the plantation family, and the transformation of oppressors into their own victims. These stories continued to circulate in African American communities throughout Georgia and beyond, serving as reminders that knowledge and skill could be more powerful than violence in achieving justice. They emphasize themes of patience, careful observation, and the strategic application of specialized abilities to achieve seemingly impossible goals. For white communities, the stories served a different function, as warnings about the consequences of systematic dehumanization and the dangers of underestimating those subjected to oppression. The image of powerful plantation owners reduced to silent followers in the forest became a powerful metaphor for the potential reversal of established hierarchies. The academic suppression of research into these cases during the civil rights era reflects the continued sensitivity surrounding themes of racial power dynamics and the possibility that enslaved people possessed sophisticated forms of knowledge that their oppressors never recognized. The fear that such stories might inspire contemporary resistance may have motivated efforts to keep them confined to oral tradition. However, the persistence of these stories, despite official discouragement, demonstrates their importance to communities that experience the legacy of slavery firsthand. They provided both historical validation and contemporary inspiration for those seeking to understand how systematic oppression could be challenged through means other than direct confrontation. The case of Blackwood Manor ultimately represents more than a single incident of mysterious disappearances. It illustrates the complex relationships between knowledge, power, and justice that characterized the antebellum South and continued to influence race relations long after the formal abolition of slavery. The silence that Moses taught his dogs to maintain became a metaphor for the hidden forms of resistance that operated throughout the slavery period and beyond. Like those dogs, enslaved people learned to move through a hostile environment without revealing their true capabilities or intentions, gathering information and developing skills that would eventually serve the cause of liberation. The transformation of the Blackwood men from masters to followers represents the ultimate realization of this hidden resistance, the moment when accumulated knowledge and carefully developed skills were deployed to achieve complete reversal of established power relationships. The fact that this transformation occurred without violence may have made it more disturbing to contemporary observers than outright rebellion. The forest community that reportedly sheltered the missing men served as a living demonstration of alternative social arrangements based on cooperation rather than domination. The sightings of this community moving through the woods in perfect coordination suggested that Moses had created more than just trained individuals. He had established a functioning society based on principles entirely different from plantation hierarchy. The eventual disappearance of this community and the return of the land to conventional agricultural use might be interpreted as the victory of traditional power structures over revolutionary alternatives. However, the lasting impact of their example on local memory suggests that the seeds of transformation continued to germinate long after the original participants had vanished. Today, the former site of Blackwood Manor is occupied by suburban development, and few residents are aware of the events that once unfolded in the pine forests that covered their neighborhoods. However, local historical societies have begun to document the oral traditions associated with the area, recognizing their importance to understanding the complex legacy of slavery in Georgia. These efforts have revealed that stories similar to the Blackwood Manor case exist throughout the former plantation regions of the South, suggesting that instructional reversal may have been more widespread than previously recognized. The common elements of these stories, silent dogs, disappeared masters, and forest communities, point to shared knowledge and coordinated action that operated beneath the surface of documented history. The implications of this hidden history extend beyond academic interest to contemporary discussions of racial justice and social transformation. The methods employed by Moses and others like him demonstrate that meaningful change can be achieved through patience, skill, and strategic application of specialized knowledge rather than through confrontation alone. The silence that characterized Moses's approach may offer lessons for contemporary efforts to address systemic inequality. Rather than demanding immediate and dramatic change, his methods focused on gradual transformation that was so subtle it remained largely invisible until it was too late to prevent or reverse. This approach required extraordinary discipline and long-term planning, qualities that enabled Moses to maintain his position within the plantation hierarchy, while secretly developing the capabilities that would eventually allow him to transform it entirely. His success depended on the assumption that his oppressors would continue to underestimate both his intelligence and his determination. The story of Blackwood Manor reminds us that the most profound transformations often occur in silence, building momentum through accumulated small changes until they reach a tipping point that makes dramatic reversal possible. The dogs that learned to hunt without making a sound became metaphors for social change that operates below the threshold of conscious detection. In our current era of immediate communication and constant visibility, the patience and secrecy that characterized Moses's approach may seem almost impossible to achieve. However, the fundamental principles remain relevant. The importance of developing genuine expertise, the strategic value of being underestimated, and the transformative power of applied knowledge. The silence that still echoes through the former grounds of Blackwood Manor serves as a reminder that some of history's most significant events may never have been officially recorded. The voices that were systematically excluded from historical documentation may have been far more influential than the documents suggest, operating through methods that left no written trace but produced lasting change. Perhaps the most important lesson from the Blackwood Manor case is that justice can take forms that are invisible to those who benefit from injustice. The transformation that Moses achieved was so complete and so subtle that it appeared to be natural rather than planned, the inevitable consequence of a system that carried within itself the seeds of its own reversal. The night the masters vanished from Blackwood Manor was not the end of their story, but the beginning of their education. In the silence of the pine forest, they learned lessons that no amount of wealth or power could have protected them from, and in that learning, perhaps they discovered something approaching the understanding that Moses had hoped to teach. The sound that still echoes through those Georgia woods is not the bark of hunting dogs or the voices of missing men, but the whisper of transformation that continues to move through the world, patient and persistent as the wind through the pines, teaching those who are ready to learn that silence sometimes speaks louder than any sound. The records end there, but the silence continues. In 1968, the last documented reference to Blackwood Manor appeared in a brief archaeological survey conducted before the construction of Interstate 75. The survey team noted unusual soil patterns in what had once been pine forest, suggesting extensive underground excavation from an earlier period. No artifacts were recovered, and the survey was completed ahead of schedule when several team members reported persistent feelings of being watched while working in the area. The highway construction proceeded without incident, and today thousands of travelers pass daily over ground that once held secrets too dangerous to preserve. The final piece of evidence surfaced in 1969 when the estate of Reverend Atwood's great-nephew was being settled. Among his papers was a single letter dated 1867, written in a careful hand that analysis would later confirm belonged to Catherine Blackwood. The letter, addressed to no one in particular, consisted of only a few lines. "I remember now what I was taught in the silence. The forest is patient. The forest is always listening. And someday the forest will teach again." The letter was donated to the Methodist Historical Society, where it remained in storage until the building was demolished in 1974. The demolition crew reported finding the archives scattered by what appeared to be severe water damage, though no source of the water could be identified. Today, the story of Blackwood Manor exists only in whispered conversations among elderly residents of Talbot County and in the fragmentary records that survived fire, flood, and deliberate destruction. But on quiet nights, when the wind moves through the pine trees that have grown back along the Altamaha River, some say you can still hear the sound of dogs moving through the darkness, dogs that have learned to hunt in perfect silence. The lesson Moses taught was simple. Those who would reduce others to voiceless obedience may themselves learn the meaning of silence. In the end, the masters of Blackwood Manor discovered that the greatest teacher is experience, and some lessons can only be learned by becoming what you have made others become. The night they vanished, they began a different kind of education, one that continues still, patient as the forest, silent as the dogs that learn to hunt without making a sound. And perhaps, in that silence, they finally understood what Moses had always known. The true power lies not in breaking spirits, but in choosing when to speak and when to remain silent. The forest remembers. The forest is always listening. And the forest is a very patient teacher.